When I first bought the ranch out on the edge of town, I thought I was escaping the chaos of suburban politics, but little did I know that the neighborhood's homeowners association, led by a woman who had been nicknamed Karen by everyone who crossed her path, would find a way to meddle in my life, even out here in the wide open country, where my only real neighbors were the cattle grazing in the pastures and the occasional coyote that crept too close at night. My land stretched for acres, fenced and gated with a sturdy iron entrance that bore my family's brand, and I prided myself on the peace and quiet that came with it. Yet from the very first month after moving in, I noticed a strange problem. The gate kept being left open, tire tracks cutting across my gravel path, and sometimes I'd even find broken pieces of ornamental plants near the drive, which at first I thought might have been careless delivery drivers, until one afternoon I happened to be repairing a section of fence when a shiny white SUV rolled right past my gate as if it belonged there. Not even slowing down, the woman behind the wheel wearing oversized sunglasses and clutching a designer coffee cup while talking loudly into her phone, not even glancing at me as she passed by, her entitlement radiating so strongly I could feel it. She drove through as though she owned the land, cutting straight across my property to reach a shortcut leading to the cul-de-sac on the other side where the HOA queen herself resided, and it dawned on me then that this wasn't a random intrusion, but a deliberate act by someone who thought the world bent around her needs. And when I confronted her later that week, flagging her down as she came back across my drive, she waved me off like I was a hired help, inconveniencing her important schedule, declaring, "You don't own the road, it's a community easement," which was flat out wrong because I'd personally checked the deed and had the surveyor mark the property lines. Before moving in, this was my private ranch road and no HOA had authority here, but she laughed dismissively when I told her so, remarking that she was friends with people on the town council and could make things difficult for me if I didn't let her pass. And while I kept my cool, inside me boiled a mix of anger and disbelief at her arrogance, because this wasn't just some nosy neighbor peeking over the fence. It was a brazen invasion of my land, a trampling of my rights, and an open dare for me to do something about it. Over the next weeks it escalated, her SUV appearing almost daily, sometimes twice, zipping through without so much as a glance, and once she even brought guests in a convoy of cars, their tires churning up dust that coated my porch and windows, and each time I called out or waved, they pretended not to see me, as if I were invisible on my own land, until finally I went to her house, knocked on her door, and told her point blank that she had to stop trespassing, only for her to sneer and say she had HOA approval, which again made no sense because my ranch wasn't part of her association, but logic meant nothing to her, power plays and intimidation did. And that's when I realized she wasn't going to stop on her own. She thrived on control, and me standing up to her only made her double down. So I set up cameras by the gate to record her trespasses, thinking evidence would scare her off. But when she noticed the cameras, she actually parked halfway down my drive, got out, and gave the lens a smug little wave before driving off again as if to say, "What are you going to do about it?" And that's when I decided I wasn't just going to block her path or call the cops who'd likely shrug at the civil matter. I was going to set a trap, one she would never see coming, one that would remind her once and for all that my land was mine, and that not even an HOA Karen with her imagined influence could bulldoze her way through my life unchecked. After that last smug wave into my security camera, I knew I couldn't just let things keep escalating because if there's one thing I've learned living both in cities and now out on rural land, it's that people like Karen don't respond to reason, laws, or even confrontation. They only respond when their actions finally backfire in a way that embarrasses or inconveniences them more than anyone else. So I sat down that evening on my porch with a glass of sweet tea and started sketching out ideas for how to deal with her trespassing once and for all. And while the first, most tempting ideas involved spikes, chains, or even cattle guards designed to blow out the tires of anyone foolish enough to ignore a gate, I knew those would get me in hot water legally because as much as she was in the wrong, the law loves to play gray area games when property rights meet personal injury, and I wasn't about to let her flip the script by claiming I'd endangered her safety. So instead, I thought like, a rancher, like someone who knows how to handle both livestock and predators without drawing blood. And that's when the idea of a trap started forming in my mind, not the kind that clamps down with teeth, but the kind that quietly outsmarts the intruder and leaves them exposed with no excuses left. The next morning, I drove into town and bought a heavy-duty remote-controlled gate system, complete with motion sensors and reinforced steel posts, then spent the better part of a week installing it across the entrance to my ranch road, making sure it sat just beyond the original wooden gate so that when she inevitably drove in, she'd be funneled straight into a holding pen of my own design, a section of drive fenced on both sides with no turnaround space, meaning once she passed the first gate and the system slid shut behind her, she'd be stuck until I decided to let her out. And I rigged it so that from my porch I could hit a button and lock her in like a stray calf in a corral, harmless. But completely cornered, to cover my bases, I even posted clear, private property, no trespassing signs along the gate laminated in bold letters, so she could never claim ignorance, though in truth we both knew she'd seen them 100 times already. But this was about building a solid case, as much as it was about teaching her a lesson. Sure enough, the very next Friday afternoon, as I was splitting wood by the barn, I heard the crunch of gravel and looked up to see that all too familiar white SUV gliding through my front gate without hesitation, her music blasting through rolled down windows, her phone once again glued to her ear, and I almost laughed as I set down the axe and pulled the remote from my pocket. Waiting until she rolled far enough into the chute before hitting the button, the steel gate, sliding, closed behind her with a heavy clang that echoed across the pasture, and at first she didn't notice, too busy yapping into her phone, until she looked up and saw the new barrier ahead, slamming her brakes and staring in disbelief like someone had swapped out the world behind her windshield. I walked slowly down the drive, wiping sweat from my brow, and when I came into view, she flung her door open and stormed out, her voice shrill with outrage. "What is this? You can't block a community access road. Do you know who I am?" And I almost chuckled because, yes, unfortunately, I did know exactly who she was, and I told her calmly that she was on private property, she had ignored clear signage, and now she was in violation of trespassing laws that I had every right to enforce. But of course, she didn't hear a word of it, too busy screeching about illegal gates and lawsuits and her rights as HOA president, as if her little suburban committee carried jurisdiction over my ranch. And while she ranted, I pulled out my phone and held up the screen showing live footage from the security cameras. Her car caught red-handed crossing into my land, time-stamped and crystal clear, adding that I'd already forwarded the footage to the county sheriff's office, who had advised me to keep gathering evidence. And for the first time, I saw her confidence flicker, just slightly like a candle in the wind, though she quickly masked it with another wave of entitlement, demanding I open the gate immediately or else. But I wasn't about to waste the opportunity one had created. So instead, I leaned casually against the fence post and told her she was free to wait there until the sheriff arrived if she thought she was in the right, or she could acknowledge that she had no business cutting across my ranch and agree in writing on the spot never to do it again, otherwise she'd be facing legal charges. She sputtered, her face reddening beneath the harsh sun, and for once she didn't have a ready comeback because the trap had left her with no escape route, literally and figuratively, and I savored the silence. The rare moment when an HOA Karen realized her kingdom of bylaws and bluffs had no power beyond its tiny cul-de-sac, and while she eventually caved, scribbling a shaky promise on the notepad I'd handed her, I knew deep down she wouldn't let it end there, because people like her never admit defeat for long, and that's why, as I finally slid the gate open and watched her SUV roar off in a storm of dust and indignation, I was already planning the next layer of my trap, one that would go beyond fences and signatures, one that would make her think twice before ever setting her tires on my land again, because teaching her a lesson once wasn't enough, I had to make it permanent. She didn't disappear quietly after that. Of course she didn't. People like Karen treat surrender as a temporary inconvenience, not a permanent condition, so within days my mailbox started filling with thinly veiled threats masked as requests for clarification from the HOA's lawyer, followed by a second package that contained a certified letter demanding I remove the gate immediately and allow unfettered community access, which was laughable on its face because the deed and the survey both said otherwise, but the letter carried the kind of arrogant legalese meant to frighten retirees into compliance. And when the sheriff's office called to say they were getting conflicting reports and suggested, We all calmed down until someone could sort the paperwork. I realized the battle had shifted from a lonely standoff on my dirt drive to something institutional, and Karen had marshaled every little tool at her disposal: the lawyer, the HOA board, the whispers at church about the strange rancher who blocked our road. So I switched into containment mode the same way I'd learned to quarantine a sick steer before it infected the herd. First, I called the county surveyor and scheduled an immediate recheck of the lines, and while we waited, I reached out to folks who mattered in quieter ways: the deputy who'd once helped me pull a truck out of the mud, the elderly couple down the lane who ran the feed store, even the owner of the little news site that covered rural county politics, explaining the situation plainly and offering them unedited footage from my cameras, because sometimes the best defense against a manufactured narrative is to let light in where darkness breeds lies, and light would be exactly what I gave them: timestamps, POV angles, and a calm voiceover explaining the facts. Nothing dramatic, just documentation of habitual trespass. The surveyor's visit was a small public event: a tractor and a pickup parked by the gravel road, the surveyor unrolling his yellow tape and marking points with a stern little spray, and while a neighbor leaned over the fence to watch, and then Karen swung by in full defensive regalia, sunglasses back on, hair perfect, followed by two board members who waved clipboards like shields. But the surveyor, impartial and dull as an owl, read the map, clicked off coordinates, and declared in his blunt way that the boundary was where it had always been: solid fact, not rumor. So when I later posted that footage online and sent a copy to the county clerk, the lawyer's demands suddenly lost their thunder because they were no longer statements made in isolation but charges countered with evidence. Still, that wasn't enough to stop her. Within a week, she escalated socially, started a rumor campaign painting me as a recluse who refuses to be part of the neighborhood, dropping hints that I harbored dangerous animals or illegally stored motorcycles, subtle half-truths shared at HOA potlucks and in whispered texts. And I watched for a while, letting those petty humiliations land where they would, because there's a limit to how much attention I want to give someone who thrives on drama. But when she took my neighbors by surprise by organizing an emergency HOA meeting about public access and packed the room with her allies, I knew the fight had to be taken to the community square. I prepared for that meeting like I'd prepare a cattle drive: clear goal, solid evidence, and everyone briefed. So I printed copies of the deed and the survey, compiled a timeline of her trespasses with screenshots and timestamps, and asked the news site to come film the discussion, not to sensationalize but to document, because once the public sees the whole story, the power of gossip tends to wither. On the night of the meeting, the hall smelled of coffee and pot roast, folding chairs in straight rows, and Karen stood at a makeshift podium with a projector, launching into the same rehearsed lines about community rights until I asked for the floor and, without theatrics, laid the facts out like cards on a table. Here are the dates, here's video of your car crossing my property without permission, here's the surveyor's mark, and here's the certified letter you sent that contained inaccuracies. And as I spoke, I watched her face change from smugness to an odd, brittle panic, because the crowd could see through the fog now. Neighbors who'd driven her shortcut once and never thought much of it realized they'd been complicit in unlawful behavior, and a few even expressed surprise that the land belonged to me, apologizing for their assumptions, while others, who'd always liked me for helping haul hay or fixing a barn door, nodded in quiet support. The HOA meeting didn't end with dramatic arrests or fiery speeches, but it did end with Karen storming out, muttering about lawsuits, and the county clerk promising to review the matter further, which for the moment was victory enough. Yet I wanted something more permanent than a sympathetic nod at a potluck, so I turned to the soft but inexorable power of community norms. If she wanted to play king, then she had to be accountable to the people she'd tried to command. So I started speaking to neighbors one-on-one, not in loud town hall fashion, but over fences and at the feed store, asking them to consider what precedent we wanted for our rural roads. Were they shared only by those who shouted loudest, or were they governed by deeds and decency? And more often than not, I found that most people didn't want to be involved in HOA petty wars. They wanted peace and predictability. So slowly, like mending a fence, I rebuilt relationships that Karen had eroded with her aggression. Meanwhile, she retaliated in the only weapon left to her arsenal: public humiliation. by posting a glossy flyer accusing me of harassment and circulating it at the farmer's market, but I responded the only way that would stick, with more evidence and more visibility. And when the county attorney finally examined the full packet deed, survey, video, the signed note from the first capture, where she acknowledged she would not trespass, the attorney advised the HOA that their claim had no legal merit, and that personified authority that Karen clung to like a life preserver suddenly lost much of its buoyancy. The final kernel of the trap, though, was social rather than legal. A week after that quiet confirmation from the county, Karen decided to pull a last desperate power move by driving onto my property during a weekend when a local charity wanted to use the pasture for a kids' petting zoo I'd volunteer to host, and as fate timing and a little planning would have it, I had arranged for several volunteers and neighbors to be present, along with the news reporter, and when her SUV rolled in, head held high, like she owned the entire horizon, the volunteers, who had seen the video and heard the surveyor, politely but firmly directed her to the public road and reminded her that this event had been arranged with the owner of the land, which was me, and the look on her face, caught on camera and spread across social feeds that night, was a portrait of someone who'd tried to rule by intimidation and had been disarmed by community and facts. And as her convoy retreated, morale among the neighbors lifted like clouds after rain. Between the legal confirmations, the public record, and a steady chorus of neighbors who now understood where truth lay, Karen's influence dimmed. She still held her title for a while, clinging to the rituals of power, but in the quiet meetings and the whispered phone calls, she found fewer allies, and where once she could march through my gate with impunity, she now thought twice before turning onto my drive, which was exactly the permanent lesson I'd intended when I set my trap, not to humiliate for the sake of cruelty, but to restore boundaries and teach that entitlement ends where someone else's property begins. And in the end, the most satisfying part wasn't that she'd stopped driving through my gate, but that a community learned to look at evidence and reason rather than gossip and rank, which made the ranch quieter, not just because her tires no longer cut across the gravel, but because the whole neighborhood had become a little wiser about respect. You said, by the time the final act of this little rural drama played out, I had learned more about patience, planning, and the strange dynamics of power than I ever expected from buying a piece of land to escape politics, because Karen, predictably, didn't give up entirely. People like her never do. But the trap I'd set, both literal and metaphorical, had reshaped the battlefield in ways she couldn't control. It wasn't just the remote-controlled gate, which now sat reinforced and fully automated, a silent sentinel across my driveway, nor was it the legal documentation that made any further claim on my property laughably futile. It was the community itself, aware now, alert to facts rather than rhetoric, unwilling to be cowed by the self-proclaimed authority of someone whose sense of entitlement outweighed her sense of reason. And as the weeks passed, Karen's attempts at small sabotage, leaving letters on my porch, texting neighbors with half-truths, or even accidentally driving near the pasture while the gate was closed, were met with either disinterest or polite refusal to participate, the social isolation hitting harder than any formal complaint could, because in the rural world, influence is subtle and earned, not assumed, and suddenly her reign of informal terror had shrunk to a faint echo. I spent one evening walking along the fence lines, inspecting the pasture and gates, feeling the warm late summer sun on my shoulders, reflecting on how easily things could have gone wrong if I'd rushed or acted without careful thought, because there's a fine line between justice and escalation, and in the end, the trap worked not because it was cruel, but because it was clever, proportional, and visible to all who needed to witness it, and that visibility created accountability, which, as I realized, is the most powerful tool in any conflict. Neighbors began waving at me as they passed, commenting on the freshly painted posts or the new signs that now included a polite thank you for respecting private property message, a subtle way of turning a once contentious barrier into a symbol of order and respect. And even children riding bicycles past the gate would glance at the sensors with curiosity, never fear, because the setup was firm but fair, a reminder of rules without threat of harm. And I smiled at the thought that Karen, who had spent so long believing she could bend the world to her whims, was now reduced to observing from her cul-de-sac. powerless to act without risking public exposure or further embarrassment. Over time, she tried to adapt, appearing at neighborhood events with forced cheer, attempting small talk and social gestures that never quite landed. And while some people indulged her politeness, most had learned to see through the veneer, and the power she thought she wielded evaporated quietly, almost imperceptibly, leaving her own ego as the primary casualty, which is exactly what I wanted, because power without accountability is fragile, and her fragility became a lesson not only to her, but to anyone else who might consider trampling boundaries without consent. As for me, I maintained my routines, feeding the cattle, checking fences, repairing gates, and enjoying evenings on the porch with my dogs circling lazily at my feet. And in those moments, I felt the satisfaction of knowing that order had been restored not through brute force or aggression, but through careful strategy, patience, and the ability to turn someone's own hubris against them. And it was oddly poetic that the thing that had once caused me frustration and stress, the constant intrusion of Karen's SUV through my gate, had transformed into a story I could tell with a grin. One that reminded me of the importance of boundaries and the value of quiet, consistent action over impulsive reactions. Because while anyone can rage or shout, only those who plan, act decisively, and respect both the law and human psychology can truly win a battle of wills without creating lasting harm. The ranch itself seemed to settle into a calm rhythm. The wind through the pastures, the clink of the water trough, the lowing of the cattle, the occasional distant crow, all composing a symphony of peace that underscored my victory, and even Karen's occasional glances from her cul-de-sac, once terrifying to my sense of private space, now elicited only a faint amusement, a reminder of how far things had shifted, and as the months rolled into a year, the entire story of trespass, confrontation, and carefully engineered justice became a legend among neighbors, a cautionary tale about entitlement, preparation, and the clever use of boundaries. And every time I recount it, I can still see her expression the first time the automated gate slid shut, the combination of shock, disbelief, and helplessness frozen in her face. A face that will forever symbolize what happens when arrogance meets thoughtful resistance. And as I lean back, in my chair at the end of a long day, watching the sunset over the rolling fields, I realized that the trap wasn't just for Karen. It was for anyone who might think that rules, rights, or personal space can be ignored without consequence, a permanent monument to the quiet, clever victory of patience, strategy, and owning your land, your life, and most importantly, your boundaries.